Good afternoon. We're going to rewind the clock back to 2009. This is about the time when in Fidelity, everybody started doing Agile, and we needed some sort of a tool to manage our work. At the time, we used RTC, Rational Team Concert. Don't know if any of you heard of it. And it did the job okay, but we didn't really have a good enterprise process for how everybody would do their work the same way. So some people started using Rally, and then people started using Jira, and we had all different tools, and nobody was doing anything a consistent way. Very quickly, it became obvious that Jira seemed to be the preference that people had. So we needed to pull together a team, make sure that we had an enterprise instance of Jira that everybody could use and use it in a similar way. The problem was there was a lot of people who wanted to use Jira, and we had a very small team. So this resulted in us having lots of Jira administrators all around our enterprise who didn't maybe have all of the knowledge they needed to have as how best to administer Jira. And this resulted in a lot of customizations. And I mean a lot of customizations. I see some of you nodding, so you obviously can empathize with this situation. So let's take a look at some of our custom fields. So you can see on here some custom fields that are related to applications. So we had 15, 20, maybe 30 custom fields trying to capture either an application ID, an application name. Some of them were free text, some of them were single select drop-downs. Some of them, highlighted in red, were even spelt wrong. And how were we ever supposed to report on our data or have any sort of a consistent process when people were using different fields for the same data? So in this instance, we were able to get all of these fields down to two, one free text and one single select dropdown. Everyone could continue to work the way they wanted to work, but we had a more consistent process. But why do we care? All we've heard about in all of our keynotes is we need to let teams work the way they want to work, and they need to do their own thing. They need to have their own processes. But we also need some sort of control to make sure we've got standards in place. So getting the balance between these is really important. So the first reason we care is performance. If you've got a really big instance of Jira and you've got thousands of customizations, it will impact your performance. So by standardizing, you can improve your performance. If you want to do reporting or get analytics, if you have everybody using similar workflow statuses, that's going to be much easier. We had nearly 1,500 workflow statuses. Now, I don't know how many different variations of to-do in progress done you can have, but we had 1,418 of them. Administration. So any of you here who are Jira administrators know that if you've got a lot of customizations, it's really, really difficult to keep your system in sync and keep everything up to scratch. Our custom field page used to take 10 minutes to load. This is before it was paginated. I know it's paginated now, but it took 10 minutes. This was before you even went in and configured any contexts. We want to integrate with other tools. So we have Jira Align. We also have some of our own homegrown tools that we take Jira data out of. It was almost impossible to integrate with some of these tools with the amount of customizations that we had. We want to have a consistent process for our associates. If somebody is working on a Jira project and they move to a new team, it shouldn't feel like they have to learn it all from scratch. They should be able to have a new Jira project and know exactly how to work it. So that comes down to usability as well. If you've got a screen that has 79 fields on it, how usable is that for the person who's actually doing the work? They're overwhelmed with the amount of fields that are on the screen. Exports. 2008 custom fields is what we had at the peak. Every time somebody wanted to export from Jira, they got a spreadsheet with 2008 columns in it, plus system fields, so let's say 2025, and all of that data was in there, all of these columns, despite the fact that they didn't use the fields. And lastly, we want to get to the cloud. We're hearing about all the really cool things that Atlassian have in cloud, and we want to get there, but we're not bringing almost 15 years of legacy configuration and data with us that we know is not going to be needed in the future. So I'm Caroline. You might have guessed I'm from Ireland. I work for Fidelity, and I have been working on our Jira application for about the last 5 years. We have a Jira Data Center instance. We have 5,000 projects, or maybe just shy of that, and about 30,000 users. So that shows you the size of the setup that we have. What did we consolidate? So we've talked about some of these already. 1,418 workflow statuses. Now we have 12. We had 2008 custom fields. We have 103. We're going to get to under 100. That has always been our target. Workflows, I'll talk about this later. We had over 2,000. We have one workflow now. Everybody uses the same workflow. Screens, 3,685 screens. And now we have 154. There's work to do here because we're still working on custom fields, but we will tidy these up further. Issue types. 466 versions of epic, story, task, bug, and subtask. How is that possible? We had issue types called watermelon, pineapple, orange, and grape. Now, if somebody could explain that to me, I would really appreciate it. We don't have them anymore. We now have 14 issue types. And roles, everything else, all of the other schemes, notifications, permission schemes, everything was consolidated down into less of what we had. People don't like this. We got a lot of pushback. Why are you trying to control us? This is working the way it is. Why are you forcing us to change? We're different. We need something different. Our leaders don't want this. We need to report up different information than you think that we need to do. This works for us. We don't have time for this. You can't force us to do this. I'm sure you've all heard all of these things when you get pushback. What we found is after doing all this work, all of these people who were pushing back are now coming to us and saying, you were right, we didn't understand, it's so much easier now, the performance is so much better, we've got better data, sorry for being such a pain, is what we get. So I'm going to talk a little bit about custom fields. This is probably the biggest one that impacts performance because all of the custom field data is loaded into your Lucene index, which is loads your boards and your search. So reducing the size of your index has a significant impact on performance. So we started off with custom fields that had low usage. So we got a lot of data from the database. You can only export 1,000 rows at a time from Jira, so it's difficult to get the data from the UI. So there are custom fields that existed that were used on older projects that those projects didn't even exist anymore. So they didn't have any usage. So we went and looked for it. There was nothing there. They were easy. We could get rid of those very quickly. Fields with similar names, talked about that already with our application. If there were fields with similar names, they were obviously trying to capture the same data. So we consolidated those. We looked at fields that were the same type. So if we had checkboxes, we looked at all checkbox fields. If we had multi-select dropdown, we looked at all of them. Are there any of these that we can consolidate together? If they weren't on a screen, why do we have them if they're not on a screen? If nobody can see it, there's no point having it. Get rid of it. We looked at fields that had all the same value. So it was actually amazing how many fields all had the same value. It's like, what is this giving you? If every value is the exact same, why do you need this field? It's never different. You never put in a different value. Cloning was a big problem for us. So with all these custom fields, every time you clone a story or an epic, the data gets cloned from the previous story or epic. And people seem to be like serial cloners, that we have things that have cloned for the last 10 years. Fields that were on their screen 10 years ago are no longer on their screen, but the value keeps getting cloned. So it looks like the field is being used, but it's not being used. So that was something that we really had to look at. In a recent update of Jira, we got really good information on the custom field screen to see the recently used. So that's another data point we use. If they're used a lot, but they haven't been used in a year, maybe this is a field we don't need anymore. And one of the biggest things that we targeted was custom fields with default values. So if you have a default value and you've all 5,000 projects and the context isn't set up correctly, every single issue and every single project gets that default value. And this is all in your index and it's all in your database. So how did we do it? So there's a lot of analysis that you need to do if you're removing or consolidating a custom field, because you have to find out if it's being used. Is it really being used or is it just being cloned, and who's using it? So once we determined which fields we were going to work on, we would engage with the power users and the admins to make sure that they knew we were doing this. So once they were informed, they could talk to their teams. We created some generic or miscellaneous fields that where people had a specific need, we'd say to them, okay, we've created a field called more info or data, and you can put whatever you want in there. It's, you can use it how you want on your team, but we didn't need specific fields for every single project who wanted to do their own thing. We use Script Runner a lot. So we copied all the custom field values when we were consolidating from one to another. We could not have done this without that ability in Script Runner to copy from one to the other. Then we started trying to make sure that the customer knew this was happening. So if we were removing a custom field, we added a description to say, this is going to be decommissioned. And if it was a drop-down, we disabled all the values in the drop-down and just put one value in that said, to be decommissioned. So they knew they couldn't use it. Their existing data was still there, but they couldn't use it going forward. And in some cases, we actually renamed the field and put do not use at the end of the field. So people would come to us and go, why does this field say do not use? Then we'd remove them from the screen. So removing from the screen is very low risk because it doesn't delete any data. Data's still there, it's just not on the screen. That's when people would come out of the woodwork and go, where's my field gone? So then we could have a conversation with them. Then we'd remove it from the search. So again, it's still there, but if they try and type it into JQL, they can't because it's not in the search. We added a banner on Jira to a Confluence page. So everything we were doing was documented on this Confluence page. So anyone who wanted more information could click on the banner and go see what we were doing in Confluence. And lastly, we delete the field. We always coordinated our deletes with a refresh from our production environment to our non-production environment. So when we deleted fields, we didn't delete them in QA and then production. We deleted them in production and kept them in QA. So QA acted as a backup for us, just in case. Now, thankfully, we rarely had to use it, but we just had it as an extra backup just in case. So that's custom fields, and let's talk about projects. I'm sure a lot of you are interested to know how we could possibly get 5,000 projects onto one workflow. This has been a dream of mine and all of my team for a very, very long time. But how can you ever get everybody to agree on one workflow, that the same process is going to work? And it goes against everything we've heard today, that we need to let teams work the way they want to. In Jira, you can have a certain amount of properties at a project level. So you can have a name, a key, an avatar, a type, a project lead, a category, a description. But it's very limiting. You can't have very much there. So if you need to categorize your projects differently and have something at a project level, you can't really do that. So we spent a lot of time looking for a plugin or an app that would give us some sort of project property information. So we could capture data at a project level that we could then use in a different way. So we had a few different plugins that we found, and then we did our due diligence, and then they weren't going to be a runner. And my head was telling me this is not the right thing to do. This vendor isn't replying to any of our emails. So what's going to happen if something goes wrong? But my heart was telling me I really want to get this in because I really want to go with the next step of my plan. And then we came across an app called Project Track. And I know Project Track are here today. They're here and they're at a stand over there. And this has just changed everything for us. So what Project Track allowed us to do was to specify configurations at a project level. And we can then access this data and use these configurations in post functions or in workflow conditions to do something different depending on what's selected for a particular project. So we have one workflow that has 12 workflow statuses. Everybody gets to do in progress, done, and cancelled. Everyone gets that. There's no choice. And after that, each individual project can go in and select which additional statuses they want on their project. So in this case, testing, review, and ready are the statuses that this team wants to use on top of the out-of-the-box ones. In the back end of the workflow, we have conditions set up that look at this field and say, if testing is true, show this transition, otherwise don't. So it shows and hides the transitions based on what's configured in here. Then we took it a step further to add additional logic because I said we have some integrations. One of our integrations is Jira Align. If we have teams that are integrated into Jira Align, they need to put an epic link on their stories. If they don't have an epic for their stories, our data doesn't roll up into Jira Align and we've got black spots. So they have to have an epic link. So if Jira Align is set to yes, once a story, and only a story, we don't care if it's a bug or a task, only stories, once it moves into any in progress or done status, they have to put in an epic link. Similarly, if they pick Scrum, they have to put in story points once it goes into an in progress or a done status. If it's Kanban, they don't have to. And the last thing we did was we put in an option for making certain fields required. So this is going to help us get rid of a lot of the field configurations that we have today. So if a particular project wants to make acceptance criteria required, they can do that. If another project wants to make a different field required, they can do that too. But it's all done project by project, and every team can customize it how they want to themselves. So I could talk probably all day about all of the different things that we consolidated, but we're short time, and these are really our two most important ones, workflows and custom fields. We learned a lot of lessons as well when we were doing this work. This has been a long journey for us, and we made a few mistakes, not too many, thankfully, but we did learn lots of lessons. So the first one is to start with your low-hanging fruit. I mean, go into your system. There's things in there already that have a delete link beside it. If delete is there, delete it, get rid of it before somebody starts using it again. So delete what you can already that has no impact. Start with that low-hanging fruit, and then start with things that are used less. That's always going to be easier to consolidate or remove. Limit the number of admins in your Jira instance. We had about 200 admins. Now we have 50. It's still way too many. The idea is to get to none apart from our enterprise team. But what we did was we created a group of elevated users, and this allows people who used to be admins to do a lot of what they could do in the past, but they can't go in and do the main configuration. So we've put them on every board so they can fix people's boards. We have a self-service tool that we built for creating projects, so they can still create projects through the self-service tool. So this elevated access group has given people about 90% of what they could do, but they can't create new custom fields and they can't create new workflows. You need to put guardrails in place. So limiting the admins is one thing, but the admins that you have need to understand that certain things they shouldn't be doing. So very early on, when we started this process, we said, no new custom fields, no new workflows, no new issue types unless you come to us. We have to approve anything new like that. You can reuse anything that exists, but know that we are going to continue to consolidate. So be careful you don't move on to something that's not being used a lot, because that's likely going to go. That'll be our low-hanging fruit. We created templates for new projects. So one of the biggest problems we had was admins going, create project and selecting Scrum or Kanban. And when you do this, it creates a new workflow scheme, a new screen scheme. It creates all these customizations that are unique to that project. Those one-off workflows then gave a backdoor where people could add statuses to their board. Non-admins could add statuses to their board on these software simplified workflows. And they were the ones creating the 1,418 statuses, at least half of them, because they were able to do it on the UI. It kind of had this backdoor in to create statuses. So by having templates and everyone has to create a project from a template, it doesn't create new workflows and new screens. It reuses existing ones every time. So nobody is allowed to create a project by clicking, new Scrum or new Kanban. They have to use the link at the bottom that says create using a shared configuration, and then pick one of these templates so they're not creating new customizations. Archiving your old projects. So this is really important. Jira has built-in archival, which is fantastic. It didn't have it when we started this. With the built-in archival, you need to make sure that you migrate people off the schemes that they're on first, because you can't remove them even if the project's archived. So if you've got a standard enterprise workflow or an enterprise screen, move them onto that stuff first, and then it'll start to free up some of those schemes that you want to be able to get rid of. In our case, we started off looking at projects after 2 years of no usage. You're going to be archived, mandatory archival, that's it. It was before Jira had archival. So what we actually do is we take a snapshot of the database and store it in an S3 bucket for long-term storage for audit purposes. But once a project is archived, it is not coming back into Jira. It's not coming back, it's gone, that's it. We can export the data out to you into a CSV, but it's not coming back into Jira. We started with 2 years, then we went to 18 months, then we went to 12 months, and we landed at 6 months. So at the start, all that pushback, I'm going to need the project. I need to go back to my old stories and see what was in them. No, you don't. You don't need to go back to something 2 years old. And we now realize they don't even need to go back to something that's 6 months old. So getting rid of those old projects starts to orphan all these configurations to make it easier to actually remove them. Listeners were really helpful to us for the cloning problem. So we created listeners that cleared custom fields on cloning, so that those fields that we were trying to get rid of, that we didn't know were they really being used or were they just being used because of cloning. Having listeners clear those out really helped us to look at that data in a different way. There's a lot of apps that we use to try and help us along the process. I mentioned Project Track already in terms of our workflow. I also talked a bit about Script Runner for copying the data from one to the other. There's a new app that we got recently called JXL that has been really, really good for us, where it overlays Excel on top of Jira. I wish we had it about 4 years ago when we were in the middle of all our custom field cleanup, but it allows us to sum up the data and summarize the data and get all that Excel functionality to do the analysis within Jira itself instead of having to export it outside of Jira. So if you haven't seen any of these apps, go take a look at them. Project Track, JXL, and Script Runner have been brilliant for us. And lastly, there's great satisfaction in this work. I love deleting things. The thrill I get when I go in and hit that delete button and see the numbers come down, and my Confluence page that shows the percentages that we have cleaned up. So there is good satisfaction. And especially when those people who push back come back and say, you were right, this is way better, we should have done this way sooner. So it's hard, but it's worth it, and there's great satisfaction. So hopefully this can give you all a little bit of a taste of what it's like to clean up your Jira instance. If you've got any questions, I'll be around afterwards, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.